If you found out that the person you learned to love came into your life only to destroy you, would you still believe that the feeling was real? Welcome to Happiness of Love, your daily dose of K-dramas. Get ready to fall in love with unforgettable stories. Can you guess which K-drama inspired this story? The council room was plunged into piercing silence. Tom Kong stared at the faces of the shareholders in front of him, feeling the weight of the blow he had just received. On the table, a compromising dossier was open, full of documents leaked to the competition. His name appeared on several pages, associated with suspicious contracts and questionable negotiations. But the problem wasn't just the content, it was the fact that no one knew how that information got out of the company. He couldn't decide which was worse, the imminent betrayal or the public humiliation. Eleanor Kong, sitting at the other end of the table, crossed her legs elegantly, watching him like a predator who had just cornered its prey. Tom clenched his fists under the table, keeping his expression neutral. He would not allow himself to show weakness. One of the shareholders cleared his throat and asked pointedly if he had anything to say in his defense. Tom took a deep breath, choosing his words with surgical precision. He said that this information was being manipulated to weaken him and that he would take all necessary measures to find the traitor. His voice was firm, but inside him, fury burned like an out-of-control fire. Someone within the company wanted to destroy him, and he wouldn't rest until he found out who it was. Hours later, in the panoramic office on the top floor, he faced the city of Seoul under the light rain that blurred the lights of the skyscrapers. The storm raging outside reflected the turmoil in his mind. He grabbed a glass of whiskey and swirled the amber liquid, trying to process what had happened. Daniel Choi entered unannounced, his expression dark. He said he analyzed the leaked files and that the leak was internal. Someone close to him was relaying information. Tom frowned, feeling the pressure intensify. He coldly asked who the suspects were. Daniel hesitated for a moment before mentioning a new employee in the administration department who seemed to have access to areas she shouldn't have. A certain Jazelle Park. Meanwhile, on the other side of the building, Jazelle typed quickly on her computer, memorizing every detail of the report she had managed to access. Her heart was beating fast, not just from the adrenaline, but from the painful memory of the reason that brought her there. His brother, the only remaining family member, had disappeared 2 years ago after working at that company. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the Kangs were involved. But to get to the truth, I would need to play this game carefully. He erased any trace of what he had just seen and closed the laptop at the exact moment a message appeared on his screen. His stomach dropped as he read the short, direct words, "He knows." She held her breath. He looked around, the office silent, just the distant sound of rain beating against the windows. Who had sent that? And, more importantly, who exactly knew? She didn't have time to find out. In the next instant, the door opened with force, and Tom Kong entered, his gaze sharp as a blade. Tension hung in the air like electricity about to explode. Tom Kong stood in front of the door, his eyes fixed on Jazelle Park, absorbing every detail of her like a predator analyzing its prey. The room seemed to shrink around the two of them, the piercing silence only amplifying the gravity of that moment. The cold light from the monitors flickered on Jazelle's desk, a faint blue reflection dancing across her pale skin. Her face betrayed no emotion other than practiced composure, but inside, her heart raced at a frantic pace. He shouldn't be there. At least, not now. Tom walked inside, steps slow and calculated. His presence was overwhelming, dominating the environment with an aura of absolute control. He said in a low but sharp tone that it was interesting how some people knew exactly where to be and what to access, even without having authorization. Jazelle felt the tension rise up her spine, but she maintained her posture, getting up from the chair with an impassive look. He asked if there was anything he would like to clarify, keeping his voice firm, even though inside he knew that this game was becoming more dangerous than he had anticipated. Tom tilted his head slightly, assessing her as if he were deciphering a riddle. She said new employees generally avoided attracting attention, but she seemed to be an exception to the rule. She held his gaze, forcing a soft smile that didn't reach her eyes. She responded that it was part of her job to be efficient, and if that meant being noticed, then that was a price she was willing to pay. Tom let out a short, almost humorless laugh. There was something about her that bothered him, something that didn't fit the mold of the other employees. Maybe it was the way she didn't seem intimidated by him, or the way her voice sounded too firm for someone in her position. He said he hoped she wouldn't have any problems working under pressure because this company wasn't a place for distractions. She responded that she could handle any challenge as long as she was given the right tools. Silence once again filled the room, filled with hidden meanings. Tom looked at her computer one last time before finally walking away. The tension took a while to dissipate even after he left, as if the air was permeated with his presence. Jazelle let out a restrained sigh, feeling the adrenaline still pulsing through her veins. That had been a test. And she didn't know if it had passed or not. Hours before this confrontation, Jazelle had arrived at the imposing Kong Group building with calculated steps and a mask of absolute confidence. The lobby was vast, clad in black marble and polished steel, reflecting the power and coldness of the company that was now part of its disguise. The air had a faint aroma of expensive coffee and refined leather, mixed with the discreet scent of executives rushing by, immersed in phone calls and strategy. His heart felt heavy in his chest as he watched the Kong Group logo shining above the reception desk. That company had swallowed his brother and spat out only silence. Now, she was there to get answers. She maintained her professional smile as she was greeted by the administrative department coordinator, a meticulous woman who made a point of reminding her that working there meant meeting an absolute standard of excellence. Jazelle nodded politely, taking in every detail around her. State-of-the-art computers, discreetly positioned cameras, folders with strategic information stacked on shiny glass tables. Every corner of that place hid a secret, and she was willing to unearth each one of them. When she was introduced to her workstation, she made a point of quickly analyzing her surroundings. Shared files, restricted access, employees walking around without realizing that there was an infiltrator among them. Jazelle felt a shiver of excitement run through her skin. He only had a few days to gather evidence before anyone began to suspect his presence. The name Tom Kong was printed on several confidential folders. He was the key to everything, and now, after that unexpected confrontation, he knew the game was officially on. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers slowly gliding over the keyboard as Tom's image came back to her mind. His gaze had been intense, analytical, as if he was already considering the possibility that she wasn't who she said she was. But what he didn't know was that she was already 3 steps ahead. The elevator glided smoothly between the floors of Kong Group, its mirrored structure reflecting the cool light from the LED panels on the ceiling. Jazelle Park kept her expression neutral as she watched the digital numbers advance. The day had started with a series of setbacks, the access password temporarily blocked, a phone mysteriously without signal, and the uncomfortable feeling that someone was already monitoring your steps. She had no time for distractions, nor for slip-ups. But the moment the elevator doors opened, a sudden shock interrupted his thoughts. The impact was unexpected. The woodsy smell of the men's cologne hit her senses at the same time her body collided against something solid and warm. Papers slipped from her hands as the weight of the encounter made her take a step back. He looked up and found himself face to face with Tom Kong. He didn't move back even an inch. His dark eyes shone in the artificial light of the elevator, his jaw tense, as if he was already impatient before he even saw her. His expression was closed, cold, almost indifferent, but there was one detail that Jazelle didn't ignore: he didn't like being interrupted, not even by accident. He took a deep breath and ran his fingers over the wrist of his watch, as if the shock had been just a minor inconvenience. He said people should pay more attention before bumping into others, especially if they are new to the company. Jazelle felt a wave of irritation rise in her throat, but contained any obvious reaction. He bowed his head slightly in a mechanical gesture, picking up the papers that had fallen and muttering an empty apology. Tom didn't respond. He just walked past her unhurriedly, as if the moment hadn't deserved more than a second of his attention. Hours later, Jazelle sat in the meeting room, adjusting her posture and keeping her gaze fixed on the screen where graphs and financial projections were presented. The board members were lined up at the table, exchanging looks and whispers among themselves, but everyone knew that nothing would be decided before Tom arrived. The air inside the room was heavy, charged with the invisible tension of an environment where every word spoken had strategic implications. The door opened with a soft click, and Tom entered. His impeccable dark gray suit fit his figure perfectly, and his sharp gaze passed over each face present before settling on the screen in front. He sat down leisurely, crossing his fingers on the table. He said he hoped to hear convincing explanations about the numbers from the last few weeks, because otherwise, someone there would have to deal with the consequences. The meeting continued with technical presentations and financial projections, but at a certain point, Tom looked away to the corner of the table. His gaze found Jazelle again, and this time, he lingered a moment longer than he should have. He said, without changing his tone of voice, that it was interesting how the company was hiring younger and more inexperienced employees. He questioned whether anyone really believed that newcomers could contribute anything relevant in a high-performance environment like that. The comment hung in the air like a calculated blow. Jazelle felt all eyes fall on her, waiting for a reaction. His blood ran cold for a moment, but he was not the type to cower in the face of provocation. He raised his chin, maintaining a professional expression and a firm voice as he replied that, in fact, many innovations came from new perspectives, and that perhaps the problem was not in experience, but rather in the resistance of some to accepting changes. A sudden silence fell in the room. Tom arched his eyebrow slightly, and something that could have been a trace of interest crossed his eyes before disappearing. He didn't respond right away. He just smiled, almost imperceptibly, as if he were dealing with an unexpected challenge. Then he looked away, returning to the meeting agenda without further comment. Jazelle knew that that moment had been a test. And for the first time, she felt that Tom Kong was beginning to notice her not just as an ordinary employee, but as someone he couldn't ignore so easily. Tom Kang's office was a perfect reflection of his personality, spotless, minimalist, and meticulously organized. The black leather of the armchairs contrasted with the translucent glass of the table, and the panoramic view of Seoul spread out behind him like a private empire. Jazelle entered with measured steps, holding a stack of reports, her expression carefully controlled. It had been a week since her first clash with Tom, and, much to her chagrin, she was becoming more and more in demand to deal directly with him. Tom didn't even look up when she entered. He continued typing on his laptop with razor-sharp precision, as if his time was too precious to waste on unnecessary greetings. He said, without looking away from the screen, that he hoped the reports were correct because he didn't have time to review shoddy work. Jazelle felt irritation rising within her, but maintained her composure, replying that she had checked everything 3 times, but that he could check if he felt the need. Tom finally looked up, his dark eyes assessing her with that coldness that seemed to be his signature. He said he liked confident employees, as long as they had a real reason to be so. She tightened her fingers around the clipboard she held. I'd dealt with men like him before, arrogant, meticulous, used to getting their way. The problem was that, unlike the others, Tom Kong was not just a powerful CEO. He was smart. And dangerous. And even worse, she was beginning to realize that she wasn't like the other employees around her. The interactions between them continued at a merciless pace. Whenever Tom called her to discuss a report, he would point out tiny flaws that anyone else would ignore, like a misaligned number in a table or a sentence that could have been more objective. Jazelle, in turn, refused to give in. He kept his head high, corrected his mistakes without protesting, but made a point of fighting back when he realized he was just testing his limits. One afternoon, as they were reviewing a vendor contract, Tom questioned why she had rearranged the sections without consulting him. Jazelle explained that the new structure made the information clearer and more objective. Tom crossed his arms, leaning on the table, and said that he didn't care if she thought the format was more efficient, because here, only his opinion mattered. She smiled, undeterred, and replied that if his opinion was the only one that counted, then perhaps he should do all the work himself. The silence that followed was dense, filled with something that Jazelle couldn't completely define. Then, to her surprise, Tom laughed, a low, restrained sound, as if amused by the unexpected challenge she posed. He said he had finally found someone who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, but that didn't mean she could come out on top. She realized that she had unintentionally captured his attention. And that bothered her more than it should have. As the days went by, the friction between them became almost a non-verbal game, an exchange of subtle barbs and loaded looks that no one around seemed to notice. Tom was beginning to realize that, unlike his other employees, Jazelle did not automatically bow down to his presence. And Jazelle, as much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, was beginning to see something beyond the cold, calculating CEO she had sworn to overthrow. The hours inside Kong Group began to blend together, forming a dangerous and unpredictable routine. Jazelle had no time for distractions. Every movement, every word exchanged, every document accessed needed to be calculated with surgical precision. But something she hadn't anticipated began to happen. Tom Kong began to trust her. At first, it was subtle. Little signs, like the way he stopped reviewing each report thoroughly and simply accepted the documents she handed over, or how, in meetings, he allowed her to speak without interrupting her. The appraising gaze that had always seemed suspicious before now carried something closer to consideration. One afternoon, when the management team made a mistake in a financial projection, he didn't even question whether it was their fault. He said he trusted her to review everything before bringing it to him and that he hoped she would fix the problem before it reached the board. Jazelle nodded, maintaining her professional expression, but inside she felt an alert light up. She couldn't allow that confidence to let her guard down. The problem was that Tom wasn't just smart. He was intense, absorbing. The more time she spent by his side, the more she realized that the image of the cold and calculating CEO hid something more complex. One night, when it was past 10 o'clock, she found him in the office, his eyes fixed on the computer screen, his expression dark. The forgotten whiskey on the table indicated that it had been there for a long time. She hesitated before speaking, but upon noticing her presence, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. He said that there were moments when he wondered if it was all worth it, if proving to the shareholders, the board, his own family that he was capable of leading the company really made sense, or if, in the end, he was nothing more than a pawn in a bigger game. Jazelle didn't expect that vulnerability. For a moment, she saw something in him that wasn't part of the controlled image he presented to the world. He said, without thinking much, that no one would continue fighting if there wasn't something that really mattered to them. He laughed quietly, without humor, and said it was easy to talk when you weren't carrying the weight of an entire family on your shoulders. After that, the conversation died down, but the energy of the moment remained between them. Jazelle felt something different at that moment, a crack in the impenetrable armor he always wore. However, as real as that connection was, she couldn't forget what she was really doing there. And as Tom's trust in her grew, so did the opportunities for his investigation. Access to internal documents became easier, and little by little, Jazelle began to put together the puzzle that would lead her to the truth. He discovered that his brother had worked directly on a confidential project, something that involved contracts with international partners and that, somehow, had disappeared from the company's system. But the final piece was still missing. One night, when everyone had left, Jazelle remained in the office, accessing the servers in search of digital traces that could have been erased. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze for a moment. He quickly closed the screens, his heart beating hard against his chest. When the door opened, Tom walked in without announcing his presence, his eyes slightly narrowed. He said it was rare to find someone so dedicated to work outside of working hours. He asked if she was trying to impress him. She smiled, controlling the adrenaline that coursed through her veins, and replied that some people did whatever was necessary to achieve their goals. Tom watched her for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded, accepting her answer. He said he liked that about her because he also didn't believe in limits when it came to getting what he wanted. The warning in his mind sounded louder and louder. She was closer to the truth. But the truth came with something she didn't expect. Tom Kong was no longer just an obstacle. And if she kept getting closer to him, she didn't know if she would be able to stay in control. Early morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Tom Kang's office, casting distorted shadows across the polished marble floor. The glow of the laptop screen was the only constant light source in the room, reflecting the unstable graphics of the company's security reports. Tom ran a hand over his face, feeling tiredness weigh on his shoulders as he analyzed the information before him. Strategic data was leaking. Confidential contracts that only a restricted circle of people had access to were appearing in the hands of competitors before they were even finalized. It was a calculated attack, a methodical attempt to undermine him from within. Daniel Choi entered without announcing his arrival, his firm footsteps echoing in the silent environment. He glanced at the mess of papers and screens spread across the table and let out a heavy sigh. He said it couldn't continue, that the company was already under too much scrutiny since Tom took over. He said that someone close to him was sabotaging him, and if they didn't find out who it was, the council wouldn't hesitate to remove him. Tom clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the pen hard enough to mark the paper beneath his signature. He asked Daniel if he had any theories, because he was tired of playing in the dark. Daniel sat in the armchair in front of the table, crossing his arms as he analyzed his friend's expression. He said that they had screened the most recent accesses to internal files and that, surprisingly, someone within the administrative sector seemed to have browsed documents that they should not have. Tom frowned, knowing exactly what that meant. The administrative sector was a controlled space, where few were authorized to access strategic information. Daniel's gaze narrowed when he mentioned that, curiously, a new employee had managed to become indispensable too quickly. Tom was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of the words settle in his mind. He said that Jazelle Park had stood out, but that didn't mean she was to blame. Daniel raised an eyebrow, his expression filled with skepticism, as he asked since when Tom Kong gave someone the benefit of the doubt. Tom didn't respond. Instead, he picked up one of the sheets on the table and ran his fingers over the margins, his thoughts spinning at warp speed. It was true. He didn't trust anyone, he never did. So why did Jazelle seem to be the exception? The following days were filled with almost imperceptible tension. Tom watched. He never watched anyone with real interest, but now his eyes seemed to register her differently. The way she moved her fingers over the keyboard with calculated precision. The way he tilted his head when reading reports, as if he were deciphering something beyond the numbers. The speed with which she adapted to any situation, as if she were prepared to face any unforeseen event. Every little detail seemed to confirm something he still didn't want to admit: Jazelle Park was no ordinary employee. One night, at the end of an exhausting workday, he found her in the hallway while she was reviewing a digital document on her tablet. The office was silent, the few remaining employees had already left. The artificial lighting created a soft glow on his skin, highlighting his concentrated expression as he analyzed the data before him. He approached slowly, letting his presence be noted before speaking. He asked if she usually worked late out of habit or if there was something specific that kept her there. She looked away from the screen to look at him, her lips curling into a half-smile that conveyed nothing but professionalism. He responded that some people needed to work harder than others to prove themselves. Tom studied her for a long moment, searching for something in her expression that revealed more than her words. There was a spark there, something he couldn't fully decipher, but it made him hesitate before jumping to any conclusions. He said, in a low, controlled tone, that he trusted only those who proved themselves to be loyal, and that he hoped she was aware of that. She held his gaze, without retreating for an instant, and replied that loyalty was a matter of perspective. The silence that followed was filled with hidden meanings. Tom felt something dangerous build between them, a tension not just professional, but something he wasn't ready to name. Jazelle was intelligent, insightful and enigmatic. Perhaps too enigmatic. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was dealing with an ally or an enemy. The ballroom of the five-star hotel was lit by crystal chandeliers that cast golden reflections on the champagne glasses and the refined fabrics of the dresses and suits that circulated throughout the event. Kong Group's corporate cocktail party brought together shareholders, investors and strategic market figures, all immersed in casual-looking conversations, but full of hidden interests. Jazelle Park moved between them with calculated ease, balancing a glass of wine in her hand as her eyes analyzed each interaction with meticulous attention. I knew that there, between carefully rehearsed looks and smiles, secrets were exchanged as easily as toasts were raised. On the other side of the room, Tom Kong maintained his impenetrable expression as he listened to one of the directors talk about the company's new phase. I was used to these events, to playing the role of the unwavering CEO, to reading between the lines of what really mattered. But that night, his gaze returned to a specific spot in the room more times than he would like to admit. Jazelle. She wore an elegantly cut, understated yet sophisticated black dress that accentuated her presence without appearing overly calculated. She moved naturally, but Tom noticed that there was always a certain distance in her eyes, as if she were never really there. This bothered him more than it should have. Ever since he started observing her more closely, there was something about her that he couldn't completely define. I needed answers. He needed to understand what exactly was pulling him towards that woman like an invisible magnet. The hours passed and the event began to empty. The guests slowly dispersed through the hotel corridors, and silence began to fill the spaces previously occupied by conversations and muffled laughter. Jazelle, who had stayed until the end to watch the latest developments, found herself alone on the hotel terrace, watching the lights of Seoul twinkle like artificial stars below her. The cold early morning wind brushed against her skin, but it wasn't the weather that made her feel a strange weight in her chest. It was the fact that, little by little, his mission was becoming something dangerous. She was getting too close. And this shouldn't be happening. Tom appeared without making a sound, his presence thick and inescapable at his side. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They just stood there, looking at the city that never slept, both immersed in thoughts that they didn't dare voice. He finally broke the silence, his voice lower than usual as he said that events like this meant nothing to him. That all those conversations, those fake smiles, those calculated toasts were just an obligation that was part of the game. Jazelle turned her face to look at him, surprised by the unexpected confession. He asked why he insisted on maintaining this position if everything seemed so empty to him. Tom let out a short, humorless laugh, looking away at the horizon before responding that, when you are born into a family like his, you have no choice. Since he was little, he was shaped to be the successor, the perfect heir. He never had the right to fail, to question, to simply be anything other than the CEO everyone expected him to be. Jazelle felt something inside her move in a way she didn't want to admit. I knew that Tom was a powerful, feared man, a ruthless leader in the business world. But here, in the cold light of dawn, he seemed just alone. Feeling a weight he hadn't expected, he said he understood what it was like to live under suffocating expectations. That, sometimes, the world pushed us down paths we didn't choose, and that the only thing left was to decide whether we would remain pieces on the board or whether we would break the rules. Tom turned to her, and for the first time, his eyes didn't carry that usual coldness. There was something different there. Something more human. He asked if she had ever broken the rules. Jazelle's heart accelerated in a way that had nothing to do with her mission. She knew the answer. I knew that, by entering that company, by infiltrating his life, I had already crossed a line from which I could not return. But he didn't say anything. Because at that moment, the truth was too dangerous. The silence between them became something palpable, loaded with unspoken meanings. The wind blew again, making a strand of Jazelle's hair come loose and brush her cheek. Before she could react, Tom raised his hand, gently brushing the strand behind her ear. It was a simple gesture. But intimate. Too much. She should have walked away. But he couldn't. And then, inevitably, he kissed her. The touch was firm but hesitant, as if he was testing a limit that even he didn't know he wanted to cross. Jazelle felt heat rise through her body, a shock of reality and illusion mixed in a single instant. Your hands moved of their own accord, sliding down his shoulders as the kiss deepened. It was wrong. But at that moment, it didn't seem like it. They didn't come home that night. The hotel room enveloped them in a temporary refuge, where neither was a CEO or a spy, where the lies and secrets stayed out. The touches were urgent, but filled with something Jazelle didn't want to name. Tom wasn't cold when he was with her. He was hot, intense, desperately human. But then came dawn. Golden light filtered through the heavy curtains, casting soft shadows on Tom's bare skin beside her. His face was serene, unlike the calculating man the world knew. It was at that moment that Jazelle felt the strongest blow. She remembered. Of the missing brother. The reason why he was there. Of what Tom represented to his mission. He felt the bitter taste of guilt in his throat. He got up slowly, getting dressed without making a sound. Each piece of clothing replaced was a reminder of the truth she needed to face. When he finished, he looked at him once more. Part of her wanted him to be just an ordinary man. But he wasn't. And neither does she. The silence inside the office was suffocating, interrupted only by the sound of keys being pressed quickly under Jazelle's fingers. The computer screen displayed a series of encrypted folders, hidden at an access level that she was only able to break into because Tom, ironically, trusted her enough to grant her administrative permissions. The building's lights had been off for hours, and the city of Seoul glowed beyond the window, a maze of neon and glass reflecting back his tense expression. His heart was beating hard against his chest, as if he already knew what he was about to find. The files were old, dating back more than 2 years. Outsourcing contracts, financial transactions, internal memos, and then, among the forgotten documents, she found it. Her brother's name was there. Park Jin-ho. Temporary employee in the research and development department, involved in the analysis of a confidential project. Jazelle felt her fingers tremble slightly as she opened the document attached to his name. It was a report about the suspension of a contract, describing a problem with an employee who had violated internal clauses. The signature at the end was clear and indisputable. Kang Jae-sung. Tom's father. Jazelle's stomach turned. Tom's father's name was confirmation that his family was directly linked to his brother's disappearance. But it was when she continued scrolling that she felt the real blow. Next to Kang Jae-sung's signature, there was another one. A second signature, discreet but official. Kang Tae-hyun. Tone. The air left his lungs in a shuddering sigh. The screen seemed to blur before his eyes, as if his own brain refused to process that information. Tom had signed that document. He knew. He always knew. The bitter taste of betrayal rose in his throat as he turned off the computer. Anger exploded inside her like an uncontrollable fire. Every word he said, every look filled with something she dared to believe was real, all of that now seemed like a farce. How could she be so stupid? How did she allow him to touch her, to break down her barriers, to make her question her own mission? But none of that mattered anymore. Now, she had proof. And Tom Kang would pay for what he did. She didn't hesitate as she entered his office. The door closed behind him with a sharp thud, and Tom, who had been reviewing documents at his desk, looked up in mild surprise. But it was enough to see her expression for his stance to change. He noticed. Something was wrong. He asked what had happened, his tone filled with a subtle warning, but Jazelle didn't waste time beating around the bush. He threw the papers onto his desk, the sound echoing through the luxurious room. He said he had finally found the truth. And I wanted to hear him admit it. Tom frowned, pulling out the documents to analyze them. His eyes darkened as he recognized the signatures. He was silent for a long moment before looking up at her. He said that didn't prove anything. That there were many documents that passed across his desk at the time and that he signed instructions without following every detail. Jazelle's anger boiled even more. She asked if he really expected her to believe that. If he was trying to pretend he had nothing to do with her brother's disappearance. Tom stood up, his movements restrained, but his expression was beginning to close. He asked what her brother had to do with all that. She felt the icy shock cross her skin. He didn't know. Or were you pretending you didn't know? How could he have signed a document like that and not remember? Jazelle's control broke. She advanced, eyes burning with fury, demanding that he stop lying. She said that all this time she thought there was something about him that was real, that he was more than just a manipulative heir, but in the end, he was exactly what she imagined. Tom stood still. The silence between them was so heavy that it seemed to have a sound of its own. Then, finally, his voice sounded, low and sharp. He said he didn't know what she was talking about, that he had never seen that name before and that if there was something hidden in the company, he would find out. But Jazelle couldn't hear anything other than the pain pulsing inside her. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter that a part of her, a foolish and weak part, wanted to believe. Because his name was there. And that was all that mattered. The glass of whiskey in Tom Kang's hand remained untouched, the amber liquid reflecting the discreet office lights. He couldn't taste the drink, couldn't feel anything other than the cold storm brewing inside him. The laptop screen displayed information he had already read over and over again, each line acting like a sharp blade embedded in his confidence. The name Park Jin-ho was repeated throughout the files, intertwined with confidential projects, old reports, and a dossier that seemed to have been purposely buried within Kong Group's internal records. But nothing hit Tom as hard as the discovery that came next. Jazelle Park. The revelation hit him like a punch. His knuckles pressed into the dark wood of the table as his mind tried to reorganize everything he knew. The woman he had let in, who he had trusted more than anyone else in recent months, was not just a competent employee. She wasn't even who she said she was. Park Jin-ho, the missing former employee, was her brother. Tom's gaze skimmed the images in the dossier, records of Jazelle's former career as an investigative journalist, headlines that mentioned her abrupt downfall following a scandal that now seemed much less accidental. She had joined the company with a purpose: to destroy it. Betrayal burned inside him in a way that not even his icy expression could hide. He mentally reviewed every moment he felt like something about her didn't fit, every hesitation in her eyes, every time he felt her holding back her words before speaking. The memory of her touch still burned his skin, and the taste of her lie was now bitter as poison. He ran a hand through his hair, forcing himself to take a deep breath. This wasn't just about what she had done to him. It was about something bigger. Because if she had managed to infiltrate that deep, then that meant there was something much worse being hidden within the company. The need to confront her was overwhelming. I needed to hear it from her, I needed to see her admit it. But an alert interrupted his thoughts. Her cell phone vibrated on the table, a call from Daniel Choi, her lawyer and only real friend. Tom answered, his voice coming out tense and low as he asked what had happened. The deep tone on the other end of the line made his body instantly stiffen. Daniel said something was wrong. Jazelle had disappeared. Tom's blood ran cold. He asked what he meant by that. Daniel explained that the building's cameras showed that Jazelle had left shortly after her last argument with Tom, but that, halfway there, a car with no license plates intercepted the route. From then on, there was no sign of her. Tom felt a wave of fury wash over him. Who other than herself would have reason to do this? And then, as if everything suddenly became clear, a single answer filled his mind. Eleanor. The image of his stepmother formed in his thoughts with cutting precision. Eleanor Kong was never just an ambitious woman. She was meticulous, ruthless, and had been waiting for years for his moment of weakness to finally wrench him from power. If Jazelle was investigating the past, then Eleanor had somehow realized she was about to be exposed. And Eleanor never left loose ends. Tom grabbed the jacket hanging from the chair and left the office without looking back. His heart was pounding, but not from uncertainty. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He would find Jazelle. But most of all, he would make Eleanor pay for what she did. Night fell heavily over Seoul, the sky filled with thick clouds that announced an imminent storm. The air was damp, thick, charged with the electricity of something about to explode. Tom Kong drove through the narrow streets of an outlying neighborhood, his car's headlights cutting through the darkness as his mind operated at a dangerous speed. GPS tracking had led him there. An abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. His chest rose and fell in irregular breaths, anger and fear mixing into something uncontrollable. He couldn't be late. He couldn't lose her. The concrete floor creaked beneath his hurried steps as he entered. The room smelled of dust and rust, and the only lighting came from old light bulbs flickering overhead. Then he saw her. Jazelle was tied to a chair in the center of the room, her face marked by a cut on her temple, her eyes fierce despite the situation. His breath hitched for a second. She was still there. She was still alive. But they were not alone. Eleanor Kong was standing a few meters away, her face impassive as if she already knew this moment would come. The woman who spent years weaving her empire in the shadows now stared at Tom with an expression of pure disdain. She said she was disappointed, that she expected more from him, that she always knew he was too weak to be a true leader. Tom didn't respond. His eyes were only on Jazelle, on the way her wrists were red from the restraints, on the way that, even in that state, she still held her gaze as if refusing to be a victim. Eleanor sighed, as if tired of her own act, and turned to the henchman at her side. He said he would solve this problem now. Tom moved before his brain even processed the impulse. The first blow came quickly, his fist hitting one of the men squarely, knocking him down before he had a chance to react. The second tried to attack, but Tom dodged it, his body moving with the sharp precision of someone who was fighting for something far more important than his own life. Within seconds, the henchmen were on the ground, groaning in pain. Eleanor showed no surprise. He just crossed his arms, his sharp eyes fixed on Tom. He said that none of that changed what had already been done, that Park Jin-ho had been dead for years and that Jazelle would never have the complete truth. Jazelle held her breath. The words echoed through the warehouse like a cruel verdict. Tom clenched his fists, anger burning his skin. said she was wrong. Because now, he knew the truth. Because now, he would make her pay for everything. Sirens echoed in the distance before Eleanor could respond. Daniel had alerted the police, and within minutes, it was all over. Eleanor was taken, her empire of lies crumbling around her. But none of that mattered to Tom. He knelt in front of Jazelle, his hands shaking slightly as he released the bonds. She didn't say anything. He just looked at him, his eyes reflecting a whirlwind of emotions he didn't dare name. He wanted to say something. But he knew words wouldn't be enough. 2 days later, the airport was full, the non-stop movement of people coming and going, each carrying stories and destinies that would never cross again. Jazelle held her passport between her fingers, her heart beating in a rhythm she refused to understand. She had made her decision. I would leave. There was something about her that needed distance, time, a chance to rebuild herself away from the shadow of everything that had happened. But then, just as he turned to head to the boarding gate, he heard the voice he didn't want to hear. Tom was there. Breathing fast, as if he had run all the way through the airport to catch up to her. His gaze carried a different weight now, something broken, something that didn't belong to the ruthless CEO she knew. He said he spent his entire life trying to prove he was strong. But with her, all he wanted was to be someone worth it. He said that if he had to choose between the truth and her, he would choose her. But now I knew I could have both. Jazelle felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something, she wanted to push him away, she wanted to remind herself of everything she'd been through, everything she'd lost, everything he meant. But then she saw his eyes, saw the truth in them. She saw that, for the first time, Tom Kong wasn't asking her to stay because of him. He was asking because he knew that together, they could be something different. The boarding announcement echoed over the loudspeakers. Jazelle took a deep breath. He looked at the ticket, at the boarding gate, at the future he had planned. And then, she looked at Tom. For the first time, she decided to trust. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Happiness of Love. That way, you won't miss any of our heartfelt romances. See you in the next love story.